Finally, we have sense stimuli. How do we interact with sculptures? And we start with touch. You can touch some sculptures, but in general, it's not about actually touching the sculpture. It's about understanding how you think it would feel. For example, this piece is made of wood. If you ran your hand across it, you could imagine that it might be a little bit rough, maybe satiny if it's really sanded down well. Maybe it's full of splinters. You'd have to see it in person to kind of be able to tell. You also get a sense of whether a piece is going to be warm or cool to the touch. A wood piece is probably going to be warm to the touch, because it's going to absorb the heat of the room very quickly. Stone, on the other hand, for example, the David, if you were to touch it or imagine touching it, you probably imagine that it's fairly cool to touch. So you can use those ideas in an interpretation to discuss or describe a piece of sculpture. But of course, remember, don't touch the sculpture. Then we have temperature and age. Now, warm and cool tones, the color of a sculpture, can affect our idea of temperature. So a red sculpture will feel warmer or seem warmer, a blue sculpture cooler. Weathering can also give us a sense of time. So for example, the Maori statues on the right with the lichens growing on that, etc., gives us a sense of age and gives us a very different sense about them than had they been sculpted a week ago and they're nice and clean. So it adds to our interpretation. It's something we need to take into account. Age also may impact our emotional response to the work, because as we read it as older, we might also read it as more spiritual or more important. Then we have dynamics. So as you move around a piece, you can get a sense of movement. Some sculptures are meant to have a sense of movement, and some are not, depending on what they are, what their purpose is, and, well, basically what their purpose is. So we have dynamic versus static. On the right, the risen Jesus in Rio de Janeiro is meant to be a static image. It's not meant to give us a sense of movement. We don't want to have the idea of a 140-foot tall image of Christ walking towards us. Instead, he's being seen as static, as something unmoving, something very permanent. And if you're trying to get across the idea of Christianity being eternal, that's a perfect symbol for it, because you don't want the idea of movement, or maybe movement interpreted as change. You want something stable and permanent. The sculpture on the left is called The Rape of the Sabine Women, although that's not actually the intention of the artist. Someone else named it. The artist here is trying to show off movement. This is a Baroque sculpture, but it's okay, we fixed it. And what we have is an old man, a young man, and a woman, and we get this sense from the spiral of the form, plus the form itself, just sort of how the individual figures are moving, of a great deal of movement. We have this young man who seems to be holding the woman who seems to be desperate to get away, the old man who seems awkwardly wondering how he got to that position to begin with. But you can't look at it and not get a sense of movement. Our eyes, our brain almost wants it to move. We're looking for that slightest movement to tell us that maybe it's real, maybe it's human. Then we have size. In sculpture, sometimes size matters. And in the case of sculpture, it's because in larger sculptures, we tend to have more mass, more size, which means it's going to have greater impact. For example, Mount Rushmore. But there's a bit of a flip side to it. As a sculpture gets larger, you usually cut the detail. The reason is the sheer size of the piece more than makes up for the lack of detail. If you look at Mount Rushmore carefully, you'll notice there's very little detail. For example, Teddy Roosevelt, the only thing that tells us he's wearing glasses is the bridge of his glasses here and a little bit of rim here and here, but the sculptor did not sculpt in full glasses. If we look at Jefferson and Washington, you see that the faces are quite similar. Really, only the eyebrows and a little bit of the nose and the hair is different. So very, very little variation, yet we read it as Washington, Jefferson, and Roosevelt. And if you look carefully over here, you can see Nicolas Cage descending from Lincoln's nostril. So the larger the sculpture, the less detailed it needs to be, because that sense of grandeur kind of takes over. And then lighting and environment. So how light falls on a piece will have an impact on how we read it. And this is an important concept, especially in churches, where we're looking at something and the artist is trying to show us that something is a miracle. For example, here we have an angel who's about to stab a Carmelite nun in the heart with an arrow. In the church, with the proper lighting, it comes off as a miracle, even if you're not familiar with the story of St. Teresa. The environment helps as well. Because it's in a church, that provides us with context. This is also why museums can be harmful to our understanding, because oftentimes we take pieces out of their original context, we put them in a museum, and now we lose some of the meaning. So that environment and that lighting can be key. And as an example, consider if we put the Statue of Liberty, say, on Lake Monona. The Statue of Liberty suddenly means something completely different than it does at Ellis Island, where you see immigrants coming in and passing the Statue of Liberty as they come into the country. Here, it comes off very differently.